trauma and attachment therapist in a private practice in Nampa, Idaho. She trained as a clinical social worker, and she obtained additional trauma-focused trainings and certifications to support her work with children and families throughout the Treasure Valley. Much of her work is done to support adoptive families as they navigate the difficult path of attachment after attachment wounds have been developed. Over the years, she has also developed a passion for the creation of trauma-informed classrooms as a means of supporting kids who come from hard places. And Janelle also owns a yoga studio in Nampa, Idaho. So we want to welcome you and thank you for being here. We are excited to hear what you have to share with us.
Oh, thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate that. And I should add this, my bio's been updated. It should say owned a yoga studio. So we closed that yoga studio a year ago, but yes, that's part of what I do is implement the body and those processes in my therapy. But thank you, Jill, so much for introducing me, and I'm really excited to be here. So like Jill said, I'm a clinical social worker. I've been doing this work for going on 19 years this year. Lots of my work has always been with survivors of trauma from the very beginning. In about 2006, I really honed in and started focusing on attachment. Today I'm going to speak with you guys about adult attachment, which is something really interesting and exciting. In 2009, I was privileged enough to learn from Mary Main, who is kind of a really important person in the attachment world. She created, along with a few others, an instrument called the Adult Attachment Interview, which I'm going to be sharing a bit about today. But that's sort of what we're talking about, is the idea of the attachments that we form in childhood, how they show up later in adulthood, and how they impact our parenting. So the intention today is that we'll start by talking about what attachment is, what that looks like in adulthood, and we'll end with some hope, which is how we change the story of attachment when insecure attachment has been handed down over the generations. Because of neuroscience and the study of attachment, which has been going strong for 100 years now, we know how to do it. We know how to create what's called an earned secure attachment and hand down a different story than was handed to us over the generations. So I'm excited to share this with you. It's one of my passions. It's part of my own story, working on healing attachment wounds that have been handed down over the generations in my own family. And then, of course, help people heal that here in this room, my therapy room. All right. Hi, I see Julie Meek. Hi, Julie. She said, so awesome with a heart. Sounds like something she would do. I'm going to share my screen here. So hopefully you guys see my PowerPoint that says the power of security. Oh, good. I got a nod from Taryn, so that's good. All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. Let's define first of all and talk about what is the generational transmission of attachment. It's a thing, it really happens. The thing about attachment is that it's a totally unconscious mechanism that gets passed down from one generation to the next, usually and almost always without our awareness. You know how they always said this to me when I had my kids, parenting doesn't come with a guidebook. And while that is literally true, nobody hands us the correct guidebook, even though there are quite a few out there, it is not actually experientially true. Parenting's guidelines actually live inside our bones. The lessons are written on the pages of our unconscious by the parenting that was done before us, and the parenting that was done before that, and the parenting that was done before that. It keeps getting handed down. It's true that we can see the connection with our own parents, right? That's fairly easy to see, the one generation handed down of a guidebook. I mean, I don't know how many times I sound like my mom and I didn't mean to. Well, that's the unconscious transmission of attachment right there. But what is less known about the guidebook that lives inside our bones, inside our unconscious way we send information, is that it's written also by generations ahead of us, with their words and their actions written into our unconscious as how-tos for parenting. So if we got really serious about this, we really could say that years and generations and perhaps hundreds of years of parenting is actually written into us unconsciously. It's a little bit beautiful if you can get there, this unconscious transmission of parenting. It's needed. It means we can parent from our hearts. We do parent from our hearts, not from our minds. For some of us, that's a little bit frustrating, though, especially when the guidebooks we have been received included things that we don't want to have written in our unconscious, in our DNA. Trauma is a really great example. Stories that live in attachment can include trauma stories, abandonment stories that we don't want to hand down. That's true in my own story, 2 generations away, 1 generation removed, not my own mother, but her mother abandoned her children when they were infants. And that story of abandonment then was handed down in my own. So a little bit of this unconscious story is frustrating for those kinds of stories, because that's written into my guidebook now. And we carry it unconscious. So what are we to do? Are we doomed? We're gonna answer that question today, what we're gonna do. And since, so nobody's on edge and stress, I'm just gonna let you know there's hope in advance. I'm going to, what's that called when they ruin the ending of the movie? Spoiler alert.
Spoilers.
Yeah, spoiler alert, there is hope. Here's the thing that's really interesting about attachment and why I like to kind of sit on my soapbox and talk about it all the time. Among many reasons, but one of them is our culture really favors our head, the things we can concretely hold on to. We love parenting books, and we love PowerPoints, for example, and we love going to parenting classes where we learn skills on the top part of our head. And those are really important, by the way. But that's not actually how we change parenting, truthfully. Parenting is changed from the inside out on the unconscious level. So we're going to talk about that today. Sometimes when I share that, people get a little bit panicked, especially helper types, because we have all the right parenting to-do books, and we're hoping that we can hand those off and fix things. Well, that's part of it, but we're going to talk about really how you get on the inside and change some of this. That's what I intend to talk about today, changing from the inside out. Today we'll talk about attachment, the basics, just the plain old basics of that, the ways attachment goes awry, how it impacts kids, specifically how adult attachment patterns impact kids' attachment patterns. We actually can predict it now, thanks to Mary Main's work with 80% accuracy, which is unheard of in the research world, but it's pretty good. And then we'll talk, of course, about how we go about the implications for how we go about helping those to change the attachment story. All of this that I'm sharing today, of course, comes from some experiential experience of my own life, experience here in the trauma world, lots of training from some experts, which I include the work of John Bowlby, who is considered here in the States the father of attachment, Donald Winnicott, who is another one, the father of attachment, Mary Ainsworth's work, Mary Main's work, and Alan Shore and Daniel Siegel's work, among many more. But this training I'm giving today is highly influenced by those professionals who have been really handing down the attachment science in really concrete and good ways for all of us. All right, so let's talk about what attachment is. The whole idea behind attachment, it kind of can be summed up in this, and that is, in the beginning there was relationship. And it's sort of pointing us to the fact that the source of all things comes from this beginning emotional relationship in infancy. We were born to be in relationship, and we come to be human beings in relationship. And that relationship in the early years we call attachment. It's the emotional bond, of course, that forms between an infant and a caregiver. And it is the means by which the helpless infant, a human who is born ready to be human, but not quite capable yet of all of this, the actions and the power needed. So they're powerless, totally born dependent upon a mature nervous system to do all that stuff for them. We know, right, that infants would quite literally die. The first thing of attachment is protection. They would literally die without the presence of a mature nervous system. And beyond that, once it goes beyond that, they rely upon the mature nervous system to integrate and become all of the aspects that it is to become human. We know that even in utero, attachment begins, but after birth, the brain is still developing and is dependent upon the environment and the transactions relationally for all of the neurons to fire. And that when that is deprived, we actually see stunted brain growth. And when it is given in a nurturing and in a good enough way, we call it in attachment world, that the brain gets to, the neurons get to fire, the brain gets to grow, and we see what's called a secure attachment, which we'll talk about shortly. Attachment is the infant's first coping system. It sets up inside the brain the way that they will go about the world and cope with the world from there on out. And it's dependent upon how the mature nervous system, how the big person, the adult, was able to help them soothe and vitalize each of their states as they went along. Here's sort of the story of how attachment goes. That immature nervous system comes into the world totally dependent. With each experience that it has with that big brain, it begins to integrate experiences, and slowly over time until the brain is done developing, which by the way is done at age 25, is using its relationships really heavily at first, and then tapering off all the way until the brain is done developing to integrate and become the important human that it is to become. Everything begins in that relationship context, that humans become humans because of that relationship experience. We know from science that there's a few mechanisms that make that possible for infants. I think that you probably can't see, there we go. What some neuroscientists are putting it down, there's a lot of mechanisms, but we think it kind of comes down to 4 mechanisms that make attachment happen. The first is to be seen, the second to be safe, the third to be soothed, and the fourth to be secure. So seeing is not just deeply seeing with the eyes, it means perceiving these infants deeply and empathically, sensing the mind beyond their behavior, what Daniel Siegel calls mind sight. So, it's kind of a pretty fascinating neurological concept, this idea of being seen. Infants and caregivers have this pretty amazing ability to be seen neurologically that gets transmitted through what we now call mirror neurons. That literally when a mom, let's say a mom in this case, picks up their daughter and they are empathically attuned, their prefrontal right cortex lights up in a way that is empathically attuned in the same way that the infant's prefrontal right cortex lights up. It's almost as though the neurons are passing between the 2 brains and touching one another, and that is being seen. So, it's pretty easy to see cross-culturally. You'll see a mom pick up a baby, and if that baby is in distress, the mom will feel the distress as her own and will respond from that place of being seen. And the same is true for warmth. When a when a baby coos or a baby smiles, the mom's body and mind responds in the same way and responds from that place. And that is to be seen, the greatest gift to be given. We know it's true that when that doesn't happen, when an infant isn't seen, they actually become either dissociated, so they have to cut off experiences, or they become highly agitated, they hyper aroused, we called that, because they are dependent upon that empathic response to soothe, which we'll talk about shortly. The safe part, of course, babies are so vulnerable. We're considered an altricial species, which just means that their babies are still dependent upon caregivers after they're born. So a lot of mammals will have a short altricial period, which means they don't need to be dependent upon parents for very long, but humans, that's not true. They're dependent upon humans for a very long time. And so they are totally dependent for safety reasons. When they feel safe, when they're able to feel safe and their brain is able to reach out in this safe way to caregivers, then they know that they can explore and do everything they need to do. There's this concept in attachment called safe base, which it's pretty common in attachment world, but it just means that when a kiddo is doing his or her exploring and they go beyond what their brain can handle at that moment. So let's say a little 2-year-old goes into a new place and they go and meet new people on the playground, for example. Well, they'll hit a point where it's just more than what their brain can handle. Like, oh my goodness, I'm tapped out. And they know now if they have their safe base, their caregiver who's their person, they'll come back and check in with their safe base and their brain integrates and soothes. And they're like, okay, we can do this. And then they're able to go and explore even more the next time. So they get to take it even further, maybe stay out a little longer. And then they come in and touch base with their safe base. And then they keep doing it. That's the process of growth and exploration and growth for kids. And that's how it happens. And by the time they get to elementary school, let's say, they try to transfer that safe basedness on a teacher, for example. And this is how math gets taught. They will go and explore math for a little while until it gets too much, and then they've got to check in with a safe base to integrate all of that information, and then they get to go explore some more. And this is how every single part of growth happens in kiddos, and it's purely dependent upon an attachment figure. We know that kids who don't have that safe base, or whose safe base is not good enough, that they will stop growing because they literally can't integrate themselves. They can't co-regulate on their own on these things. And so they will stop growing, or it will hinder their growth. So safe base is extremely important in this process. The other thing, an important mechanism of attachment, is that soothing process. You've heard me talk about it as we've talked about being seen and safe. Both of those things function to soothe the nervous system. When a kiddo is experiencing a difficult emotion and becomes on the edge of becoming dysregulated, meaning that it's more than their brain can handle and their brain's sort of on high alert, that they are totally dependent upon mature nervous systems to soothe that state for them. That beautiful process of soothing will eventually turn into self-soothing. But there is no way self-soothing can happen without first the co-regulation action. And it really is a all the way until the brain is done developing process that this needs to happen. Of course, in infancy, that soothing behavior is totally dependent upon mature nervous systems outside of them. By age 12, they're still needing to be soothed, but there's a little bit of self-soothing capacities in there depending on how well co-regulation happened in early years. And then, of course, in adulthood, they rely on soothing just the way adults do, which they still require. We are still totally dependent upon relationships to help soothe our nervous system, just not the same way as in infancy. And then the final one is secure. We help them develop an internalized sense of well-being. The whole purpose of these early relationships is to develop this beautiful safety net inside them. It's this internalized sense of well-being. It's really the best gift we can give any human being, is this internalized sense of well-being, an internal safety net, this thing that says they catch themselves in a way, but it is so interdependent, because secure kids know, and secure adults know, how to ask for help and how to turn towards one another in an interdependent way. But they also have the ability to go inside and sort of regulate their nervous system, because it was shown to them in those co-regulated relationships. Really the best gift that can ever be handed down. And what I would say is one of the best factors for resiliency. Kids who have a secure attachment go through traumatic experiences and end up bouncing back out of them fairly well, because of that internalized sense of well-being. They do it far better than those who don't have a secure attachment. And so when, for example, when adults come in here into my therapy room and they've experienced some sort of trauma in adulthood, for example, sometimes I see first responders. And if any of those people come in here and they've been gifted the secure attachment because the generations have handed that down that's just the way that ended up for them. Their healing from traumatic experiences is exponentially less than a person who comes in with an insecure attachment. So it really is one of the best gifts we can give anyone as we move through life. So let's talk now a bit about categories of attachment, like what happens with the attachment story and when it's handed down. I've talked a little bit here about the secure attachment and what a gift it is to give. So what does it mean? It means that the secure attachment bond that meets a child's need for security, calm, and understanding allows for optimal development of the child's nervous system. So because of the secure attachment, a kid's nervous system was basically soothed most of the time, which meant that they were able to go and explore life and grow and develop optimally. They didn't have to tend to fear, for example, or being left alone. And so they were able just to go explore. It turns into an internal sense and feeling of safety. This can result in healthy self-awareness in adulthood, eagerness to learn all the way through childhood, empathy, and trust. Really great things. I speak with a lot of teachers, and of course, these kids who come in with a secure attachment are teachers' favorites. Teachers don't have favorites. They love all the kids. Let's just be really clear, every single one of them that I've ever met. But these secure kids come in and they're just ready to learn. Math may be challenging for them, but they kind of can push a little bit harder because there's nothing really getting in the way of this secure attachment. It's a little bit of a different story with what we call insecure attachment. And we've got 3 categories of insecurity. We call one the anxious attachment in childhood. We call one the avoidant attachment in childhood. And then the third one, I'm sorry, I thought this said the other one, but there's a third category of insecurity, and that is called disorganized, which we're going to go through each of these. So the one that we call insecure anxious, it's the child who is frightened by separation and continues to display anxious behavior once the caregiver returns. These kids are often difficult to soothe and clingy. And so for whatever reason, the attachment story that lives inside this kid's nervous system is that perhaps their needs won't get met, and they're sort of like clinging to anyone who can soothe and holding on tightly. These kids typically are what we call hyperactivated, so their nervous system is in a hyperactivated state. They rely a lot more on their sympathetic nervous system for response. So think increased heart rate, sweaty. Their bodies are sort of wired or up in a way that says they're not as safe as they would like to feel. Now, an insecure, anxious attachment can come for lots of different reasons, some of which are not good enough parenting, but not always. It could be possible that someone developed an insecure, anxious attachment because they had early hospital issues, and their parents may have been good enough, but the environment couldn't meet them. They had to be in the NICU, let's say, or they were in and out of surgeries that were extremely terrifying, and their caregiver couldn't be present for them in those moments. It could have been because of a military deployment. And so there's, we tend to always say, you know, it's because of parenting, but I like to just leave the options open. There are lots of things that can cause an insecure, anxious. If it is about parenting, it could be true that a parent's attachment style was avoidant, which we'll talk about shortly, and that the story that was handed down to them etched them into an avoidant attachment style, which made them less emotionally present and available, a little bit more dissociated for a kid's needs. And somebody could have developed this insecure, anxious attachment. We've got the insecure avoidant attachment. This is the kid who reacts fairly calmly to a parent's separation, but does not embrace their return. So kids who are avoidant sort of turn off their need to be soothed, even though they still need to be soothed. They dissociate it, and they tend to be a little bit avoidant. They we had this assessment years ago created by Mary Ainsworth and a few other people, where they could test and see a kid's attachment style by a test they called the strange situation. So when a kid is put into a novel or new situation, the nervous system has to sort of rely upon mature nervous system, their caregiver, to help figure out that situation. And for a kiddo who had an avoidant attachment, they didn't overreact when the parents left. We're okay with that separation. But what they also did is, as they went and explored, they didn't come back to check in with a parent or caregiver, and they weren't therefore able to explore as much. So insecure avoidant is sort of a detached or dismissive avoidant. Sometimes the insecure avoidant attachment, again, can come from lots of stories, same ones I shared with the anxious one, depending on what's going on, and could have also been present because of an anxious or an ambivalent attachment from an adult caregiver. So if an adult caregiver is clingy and a little bit too much in the boundaries, we like to say, all over the space, a kid might have needed to push that away to find their own sovereignty or their own ability to be within their own boundaries, and they've had to be avoidant for that reason is one reason that could have been. And the research done with the adult attachment interview says that that's true a lot of the time with these parenting transactions. And then we've got, in an insecure category, what's called the disorganized attachment. So disorganized attachment is what we consider an ambivalent behavior towards a caregiver upon return, approaching when turning away or even hitting the caregiver, and may be the result of childhood trauma. So this is, the disorganized attachment is sort of a don't come here attachment style, push away and clingy at the same time. And usually these this form of insecure attachment comes when trauma is involved. That could be trauma within the family system, or when the caregiver is the source of trauma. Oftentimes we see these kids are the ones that are seeking therapy. The kids with reactive attachment disorder fall usually, almost always, into the disorganized category. We see this show up later in adulthood with some pretty significant issues that show up to therapy, which we'll talk about shortly. So these translate, these attachment stories that get handed down and we walk around with. We've got secure, of course, the anxious, avoidant, and disorganized. These stories get written, into the unconscious of kids, and they grow up and become adults, and those attachments stories go with them, unconsciously walk with them. And so we now know, and we've categorized these in adulthood as secure, anxious, preoccupied, dismissing avoidant, and fearful avoidant. And so the work of Mary Main has helped us understand exactly what these look like. And so it's basically the same idea. Secure attachment is an adult who walks around with that safety net, engages in relationships, with relative ease, feels safe and secure in relationships, can put up boundaries pretty well, pretty safe. Then we've got the anxious, preoccupied attachment in adulthood, which is that we called it in childhood that clingy behavior. So doesn't feel as safe and needs closer proximity to their partners or people in their lives to feel secure. Then we've got the dismissing avoidant, the ones who push away relationship and need distance in order to feel safe and secure, hard ones to be in relationship with. And then the fearful avoidant is what we call disorganized in childhood. This is that one that's come close, don't come close, often sabotaging relationships. What we might say is sabotaging relationships, even though it's a completely beautiful coping strategy that they've learned in childhood. We see these show up oftentimes in into therapy. And oftentimes the ones that fall in this fearful avoidant have significant amount of trauma and may cause some lack of safety in their own for their kiddos because of the inconsistency of closeness and apart. Again, as I've been mentioning, the work of Mary Main and the years since has helped us understand how adult attachment creates attachment patterns in childhood. What the research is showing is that if a parent has a dismissive avoidant attachment style as they are parenting their kids, there is a high likelihood that they will create an attachment story or pattern that is anxious. Now, I want to be really clear. This is true if they haven't created what we call a coherent narrative, which we're going to talk about next. This is if they're just going on and parenting without looking at their attachment style. So we're going to get to hope pretty soon. But the dismissive avoidant parent can create attachment patterns of anxiety in the child's attachment. The anxious preoccupied, so the anxious parent can create what we can call the avoidant child attachment pattern. And then the fearful avoidant can hand down the same disorganized attachment to kiddos throughout attachment. And so that's the story is kind of great. That's not fun, right? The story is grim. And this is why Mary Main came up with her protocol, which is called the Adult Attachment Interview. It was released first primarily for research, but has now been released about a decade ago, was released for clinical work. And basically this interview is used to help parent, in clinical circles, it's used to help a parent become aware of the patterns that were handed down and begin to help them gain insight both on the top part of their brain and then doing the work on the inside to change the pattern. So this interview is kind of genius. Originally, Mary Main created it so that we could predict exactly what we're looking at here. Is there a way we can predict attachment styles? And now we know it. We know we can predict it. And so with that information, we can use this stuff to go in and change it. So it's kind of an amazing thing. The AAI, I just like to give a little pull for it. Not very many people are trained in the AAI, and especially here in the Treasure Valley. And so I just put it out there that says you should go get trained in the AAI, the Adult Attachment Interview. Please, I can tell you how to do that, but there aren't very many of us over here in the area. And it's sort of it can be a tool, an important tool in changing these attachment stories, which we need to do here in the Treasure Valley. So I just wanted to give a plug for the Adult Attachment Interview. So, are we all doomed? The question is, are we all just doomed to keep that attachment story going? Is this how it always has to go? That if we were handed this attachment story in our unconscious, that we are doomed to hand it down to our kids? And the answer is resoundingly no. We are not doomed. Daniel Siegel, who's a pretty big researcher and neuroscientist, says that the best predictor of a child's security of attachment is not what happened to his parents as children when they were children, but rather how his parents made sense of those childhood experiences. When we create a narrative of who we are, we link past and present so we can become the active author of a possible future too. We are doomed if we assume that we're okay and we can just keep parenting as we are. But according to the research and what Siegel's saying here, we are not doomed. And in fact, a better predictor of child security is how we as parents have gone back and made sense of our childhood experiences, and done the work to create within ourselves our own secure attachment, which we call an earned secure attachment. It's never too late to develop an earned secure attachment. And so that's what the rest of today is about, is what we can do to help others or help ourselves develop an earned secure attachment. An earned secure attachment is essentially in the nervous system the same thing as a regular old secure attachment. What I always say is, as I've taken this beautiful journey with lots of people and have taken the journey for myself to earn a secure attachment, is that we kind of have to tell this story. I have to tell this story of this beautifulness, because a lot of people who have a plain old earned secure attachment, a plain old regular secure attachment, one that was handed down to them from their own parents, and they gained this security unconsciously, right? Maybe the generations of their family were able to continue to hand down a secure attachment. I know a lot of people who that was the case, and I felt really jealous of those people when I was healing my own attachment wounds, because they didn't do anything special to get that. They just were born into this family, and I happened to be born into one where abandonment and trauma was common, and it felt so unfair to me. And that was until, and it is unfair, just to be really clear, it is the most unfair thing. And that's the way that goes. What is so beautiful is that people who take the journey into developing an earned secure attachment, which is hard work and the road less traveled for sure, but we have the ability to create this security consciously. And I have to tell you, observing it from my therapy chair and also walking it in my own life, there is nothing more beautiful than consciously becoming aware of your own inner security and building your own safety net, which I say building your own. What I mean is trusting relationships enough and learning to reach out in an interdependent way is a beautiful process that I think there's nothing more beautiful to observe, in my opinion. The way that this gets development is the combination of relationship plus insight plus time, and that creates an earned secure attachment. let me talk a little bit about what I mean by relationship there. Because attachment wounds happened in relationship, it is relationship that can heal it. We can spend as much time learning the skills and trying to learn a few things, but it isn't until we take the step of implementing those things in relationship and trusting relationship and learning things in relationship. It isn't until that happens that this deep inside thing occurs from the inside out. This relationship can take lots of forms. It can be a romantic partner. It can be, of course, a therapist. It can be any other form of powerful relationship, but it has to be combined with insight, which we're going to talk about here in just a second. The ability to reflect on inner states and the ability to create what we call a coherent narrative of the past and the present. And then, of course, time. So relationship plus insight plus time equals an earned, secure attachment. Let's talk a little bit about this first part of creating an earned, secure attachment, or one of the parts, which is creating a coherent narrative. So there's lots of neuroscientist researchers. Daniel Siegel is the one who kind of preaches this a great deal, but he's not the only one that says the research suggests that creating a coherent narrative is extremely important in earning security. And so as this picture sort of shows, it's about grabbing parts of our memories and history and putting it together in a coherent narrative about what happened to you as a child. Now, this is an interesting something because there's a couple things in our current culture that hinder this. For one, of course, there's that thing that says, we can't talk about the past because we can't, like I hear it all the time, we can't blame the parents all the time. We have to take responsibility for ourselves, etc. And the truth is that this thing of creating a coherent narrative and going back and talking about the ways, the things that happened in childhood that helped create that insecurity is taking responsibility. It is the ultimate form of taking responsibility. The other thing in our culture that hinders this is that actually in the mental health realm, particularly in the kind of way of things in mental health just before the decade of the brain, which the decade of the brain started in the 90s and is just now kind of filtering down to change the way we do mental health. But before the decade of the brain, the idea was we don't do hard work like that. We don't go deep into that stuff. We stay in the here and now. We talk about behaviors. We do cognitive approaches from the top part of the brain. And so the mental health world was trained just recently to not do this deep stuff of the coherent narrative. In fact, I didn't learn any of this in my therapy training until a few years after I had my master's degree and went on and got specialized training. Thankfully, the mental health community is changing, and the science is just so clear that we have to do it a different way from the bottom up, we call it, that now we are seeing therapy speak to this coherent narrative a bit better, but that wasn't true the decade before the current one we're in. And so we're still seeing that, and I'm sure any helpers on this call can see that for sure. I usually get a lot of people that nod their heads when I'm talking about that. But creating a coherent narrative, so, within your own life, going back and making sense of the things that happened, feeling the things that happened, and allowing it to integrate into a coherent narrative that flows together. The other part that is really important in this earning a secure attachment is tending to what we call in the therapy realm or in neuroscience as the window of tolerance. So do you remember earlier today or just a little bit ago, I was talking about some of the mechanisms of attachment were happening, which were being seen, being soothed, and what was the other S? Safe, being safe. Well, what all of those things we're doing, we're creating within the kiddo this safety net, which is right here in the middle zone, the optimal arousal zone. Every time a kiddo got soothed at the good enough, appropriate times, they were placed here in their optimal arousal zone, meaning they felt safe. They were able to sort of enter the world in an open and receptive place, and were like, oh, world, please teach me. Let me learn math. Let me learn how to walk. Please let me learn how to ride this bike, because they were soothed well and their brain was in that state. Well, in adulthood, for people who are carrying that insecure attachment story, they're carrying a story within their window of tolerance in their nervous system, where that space in the middle, that optimal arousal zone, is smaller. It's not as big. And so the healing of this and that movement towards an earned secure attachment is really widening that arousal zone. On the other side of the optimal, on the up part, we have hyper arousal zone, which is where anxiety lives, where the anxious attachment lives. And then we have on the bottom part, the hypo arousal zone, which is where the avoidant attachment lives, and lots of dissociation lives there. And so we're trying to relearn how to be safe right there in that middle zone. And that is part of the earned secure attachment. There are lots of ways science says to teach this, but it all lives in taking care of the body, honestly. And so Julie earlier today was doing a great job of actually helping us find our place right here in the optimal arousal zone. She was giving us space to be quiet and tune in to our internal state, notice it, using a really great approach to get us there. And what she was doing was getting our nervous system into this open and receptive space. And that's what we're wanting to learn in an earned secure attachment. So it's done in so many ways. Meditation is for some a good way to get there, not for all. Body approaches like yoga, and using sensory deprivation tanks, and going to massages, and spending time in nature, and developing disciplines of getting into that open and receptive place, which lives in a part of our body called the vagus, the one, we've got two zones here, the dorsal and the ventral vagal, that we're accessing. Anything that gets us there is a practice of enhancing our optimal arousal zone. And that is an extremely important thing. So we should be adding meditation to every parenting class we teach, because a great predictor of really great parenting is a parent who is able to stay in their optimal arousal zone. And so it's so interesting. I go to parenting classes, really good ones actually, that teach really amazing skills, how to use time-ins appropriately, and all of that. But I would say that a parenting class needs to begin with getting into the optimal arousal zone, because that's where the good stuff of attachment happens. The beauty. When I teach this to my students, I get a little weird, and I say that maybe the answer to every world problem lives right here in the optimal arousal zone. I'm actually open to the possibility I'm right there, but maybe not. I was so happy when Julie brought up self-compassion. Of course, this practice has been shown by research to be part of healing attachment wounds and moving us into a earned secure attachment. And so a great parenting skill we should be teaching is self-compassion. People who have been gifted a secure attachment are better at self-compassion than people who have not been handed a secure attachment. And so as we are building in this ability to find safety within ourselves, or teaching others to find safety right there on the inside, to get into their vagus nerve, their ventral vagal and dorsal with safety nerve, self-compassion is an avenue to get there. Being touched by and not avoiding your suffering. So it's a really great one. I start with self-compassion in healing attachment wounds with lots of my clients, Because when we go into the work of creating a coherent narrative, of putting together stories, there's a lot of stuff that comes out. And this ability to turn towards ourselves and give ourselves self-compassion is the catalyst from which a coherent narrative can be created without shame and without re-traumatization. Kristen Neff is a really big researcher on self-compassion. And then, as Julie mentioned, Tara Brock has a lot to say about this. There's a website, I believe it's org, that Kristen Neff has created that has some tangible hands-on resources. From her theory, from her practice, she's combined 3 elements of self-compassion: self-kindness versus self-judgment, mindfulness versus over-identification with thoughts, and common humanity versus isolation. It's really a beautiful process, these elements that can be worked on for self-compassion. She's got a good book and a bunch of resources. So self-compassion should be part of the parenting, the fixing of this, the earning secure, every parenting class, perhaps. So that's the beginning. Those are the beginning parts of earning a secure attachment. I wanted to add, I've been doing a little bit of work this year, and so you guys are the first to hear this from me. So give me some feedback on what you think about this, please. These next 3 things is I've been working on combining up all the ways we know of how to create an earned secure attachment and how to apply it to specific categories of attachment. So I'm going to share with you what I've found, and I'd love to hear what you think about it, and go give it a try and see if you think it works. The first one is, let's begin with avoidant or dismissive attachment. So parents or adults who have that dismissive attachment category. So they enter relationships and they need space. They feel safe when they are able to push back a little bit more. So these can be really frustrating people to be in relationship with, and they are beautiful humans, because intimacy is so difficult to achieve, because they won't let intimacy too close. So here are some strategies for a person who has that avoidant attachment and is beginning to gain awareness of that, and is putting together their coherent narrative. The first thing they need to do is become aware of nonverbal signals. One approach for them to do that is I turn on the TV without the sound on. I heard this at a training recently and or I guess it was 3 years ago now, but really paying attention to nonverbal signals. This is something that an avoidantly attached person misses out on, and they begin to bridge the gap in their brain between a couple portions of their brain by doing that. The other thing we can do with an avoidant attachment is build autobiographical memories. One way we can do that is to write down, a task these people can do is write down details of what they did. I always suggest doing it backwards. So every night sitting down before bed and going through their activities, but doing it backwards. It's a very important skill for autobiographical memory development. Another thing they can do is pay attention to any desires they have to be close to people in their lives. If you've ever sat with someone with an avoidant attachment, in an intimate way, I've sat with them here in my office. They sort of have to, their attachment stories have locked them in a little, I always say a chamber, that it's so protective, but they feel so alone often, and they want to find ways to bridge the gap between people, but it's not safe. They don't have that template, that working model in their brain that does this. And so it's important to work out, to identify that they actually do have a desire to be close, and to begin just one person at a time reaching out to another person to express feelings of wanting to connect. This is sort of a impossibility, it seems, for people with an avoidant attachment, but in the safest place, they can do it one connection at a time. And then always important to work on that window of tolerance. So here it is. People with dismissive attachment tend to live a great deal of their time in their down zone, in the hypo-aroused zone, a little bit more lethargic, and we call it shut down a little bit more. And so tending to the window of tolerance and teaching themselves, training to live in that optimal arousal zone is super important for the avoidantly attached person. The next one, let's talk about strategies for the anxiously attached person. So remember, the anxious attachment is that seeking proximity and closeness, on high alert, kind of, we might call them clingy. So anxious attached people, again, these are people that are really hard to be close to because there's no space for another person to exist. All that anxiety takes up so much space. Their need to feel safe is so high that it takes up a lot of space in the relationship. Their attachment stories have told them they need to do that in order to feel safe, and so they're doing it on high alert. So here's some strategies for the anxious attachment. Cultivate the ability to name internal emotional states. It's a thing we call name it to tame it. Another really great strategy from Daniel Siegel. We just have to describe what is felt, and there doesn't need to be any explaining, just that it is felt. That you notice it coming up. My heart rate is increasing and I feel afraid. Name it to tame it. That name it to tame it strategy is so similar to the being seen attachment approach that good enough parents give their kids. So if a kiddo is sad, a parent will match their internal states with them, and they might even say, "Oh, you're sad." And a kid feels seen, like they are who they are in their own right, and that alone works wonders. And this name it to tame it is the same thing, to giving the ability for that part of you to be seen is a pretty big deal, and can often soothe pretty quickly. Another good strategy for the anxious attachment is journal writing. It's using the left hemisphere's drive to tell a logical, linear, language-based story. Lots of times the anxious attachment lives a lot in their right hemisphere, but in an uncontained way. And so we bridge over into the left hemisphere to help a little bit with that. Another thing for the anxious attachment is to pay attention to when your attachment system goes into overdrive, when everything gets hyperactivated. Focus on keeping an internal state of calm at these times when possible. So remember, in the window of tolerance, that up zone, the hyper-arousal zone, is where the anxiously attached person lives. They're living in their sympathetic nervous system, the part that tells them fight or flight. Their heart rate's increasing. And so tending to that internal state and bringing in the gifts of calm can help with this. And it's a process for people who have been wired to protect themselves through hyperarousal. It's important to always recognize that each of these attachment strategies that were chosen for brilliant purposes. Our unconscious doesn't do things willy-nilly. Our unconscious does things to keep us safe and make us feel secure. And so whether it's dismissive or avoidant, those approaches were brilliantly created, and it really, from a survival perspective, is quite amazing. And so we're just bringing in safety. We're just bringing in and saying, you know what, good job, hyper-aroused zone. Now let me give you the gift of some safety. Really important. And then let's talk about the disorganized attachment. If you'll remember, the disorganized attachment is this attachment system or attachment response that's both pursuing and withdrawing at the same time. It's usually the result of trauma or being parented by somebody with a disorganized attachment. can be really hard. These are the clients or the people who do seek therapy pretty highly because it doesn't serve them well in adulthood, or they have a lot of stuff that comes up they'd like to become aware of. For disorganized attachment, I think it is great to keep a journal and be sure to write about times when you feel triggered, or your internal world when your internal world may feel fragmented. That disorganized part of in the nervous system feels a bit fragmenting, and we call it fragmentation. When investigating the past, when creating a coherent narrative, it's important to use the RAIN approach. I think that today you may need to write down the RAIN approach. It's now showed up twice today, so maybe it's important for you. This RAIN approach is a little bit different than the one that Julie shared earlier, but it's kind of the same. This one's specific to trauma. Recognize the trauma or loss, accept it occurred and may be in a state of needing resolved. Investigate the nature of the experience in our past and present lives. Non-identification with the experiences, they do not define you. That's what therapists who work with a disorganized attachment tend to do, is this process over and over again. And then there's this really genius approach called the sifting or SIFT method, very similar to the approach we were using with Julie earlier today. The only difference is just acronyms. So when you sort of tune into your internal state and pay attention to the sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts that emerge, without identification and without judgment. It's another way of naming it to tame it. A really beautiful sifting, really beautiful practice, the SIFT approach. That one's created and promoted by Daniel Siegel. So there's that. I put on here just 3 resources. There are so many. I have a list I'd be happy to send that I give to people that's probably 150 resources long. But these 3, I think, are really good starting resources for what we're talking about, this earned secure attachment. Of course, Kristen Neff's work on self-compassion, Daniel Siegel and Tina Payne's work on parenting from the inside out, and then a really good work and book called Attached, which just specifically talks about adult attachment. That's what I've got for you today. I hope it's really clear that I am going to open it up for questions because we've got just a few minutes. I'm fairly certain we've got a few minutes. I'm going to look and see. Tara, I have a few minutes. Taryn, right? Yeah, I thought so. Okay. If anyone has any questions or discussions, but I'd like to just sum up what we talked about, that attachment is intergenerational. It's just the way of things, that the parenting book gets handed down in our bones. And that doesn't mean that we're stuck with bad attachment stories, that we know exactly how to turn around and fix it from the inside out. And so I'm hoping today we began that conversation. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
Janelle, there's a couple in the chat. Carrie also says we only have 5 minutes left, but it says, hi Janelle, as adults, if the parents still cannot help support the earned secure attachment, who provides the adult earned secure attachment typically that you have found in your practice? This was from Tanil Kober.
Okay, let me, so I want to make sure I understand that if the parent doesn't get an earned secure attachment, where do they get it? Like, where can they find the adult relationships? Is that the question, Tanil?
Yeah, actually, when I sent that, it wasn't long after that you kind of answered my question, so that was good. Yeah.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay.
Do you also find that doing attachment theory work and EMDR kind of work together as well? Like you do one and then the other, or and at the same time?
Yeah, so I do EMDR work, and there is, yes, you can very much use attachment work in EMDR. It's more of, if you understand EMDR, we take it from more of a resource installation standpoint than we do trauma reprocessing. So attachment, that safety net, it becomes the resources, you know, the internal resources to go about the world. And so we use EMDR to maybe implant some of those resources. It's only a small aspect of attachment work, though. The relationship is by far the most important. Okay. I'm happy. Yes, there you go. PowerPoint. Taryn just said, I'm happy to share my PowerPoint with everybody and can keep that. So that's good. There was a question, you talked about attachment in children in school and how a secure child can learn and the insecure child has difficulty. Do you believe that is related to Maslow's hierarchy of needs? It certainly is. It absolutely is an aspect for sure. You know, so from just basic, if they are still in an unsafe situation, Maslow's theory is very clear that says, if that's not met, there's no way higher functions are happening. And you have to, you absolutely have to get that met before we get there. So that's one for sure. And then the other aspect is specifically the status of the nervous system, totally interconnected, but yes, that is true. How do you approach parents who don't recognize their own insecure attachments? That's a really good question. So because this change happens from the inside out, it has to come from the inside. And so the way I attach parents who don't understand their insecure attachments is a couple ways. One of which is patience, extreme patience. I have worked with lots of different parents, and I want you to know that it is very rare, and I kind of want to say I have never met a parent who wants to, at somewhere inside of them, there's something that wants this to be right, you know. And if we're patient enough and warm enough and kind enough, we get there. And very gently can bring it out. It's usually not through confrontation. I'm telling you that in my experience. It's not me saying, you have an insecure attachment. Maybe a few times I've pulled that one out and a parent is like, oh, let me go check that out. It's usually through the process of validating their strengths and working with them and then bringing some insight in there. I hope that answers that question. Oh, where do disorganized folks live around the window of tolerance? They're alternating between that down part, the hypoactivated, and then the hyperactivated. So they're up and down. They sort of alternate between the two. They sometimes live in their sympathetic nervous system. Sometimes they're in the dorsal. So that's why. Maybe one more, it's 10:13 according to my clock. Maybe if I can, there's one more question, we can let that be the last. Chris, you asked, how can we get the list of resources? Why don't I just send that list of resources out to the Idaho Children's Trust Fund, and I'm happy to send it to everybody, for it to go out to everybody. Yep, I'll do that. I'll send it to you, Taryn. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about adult attachment. I don't get to do it very much, so thank you.
Thanks, Janelle.
Yeah.
Thanks, Janelle. And everyone, please go fill out your workshop evaluation. It's right. The link is actually right under this workshop on Padlet.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for